I was asked firstly, because of this, I guess the kind of the motif of the speakers of the day, to kind of say something that's a bit odd or unusual about me. So apart from being Executive Lead for Strategy and System Development at the Greater Manchester Health and Social Care Partnership, I own a football club as well. I know, that's quite impressive, isn't it? It's slightly less impressive because I'm a co-owner of a football club, and there are thousands of us that do it, and the kind of the membership fee for owning a stake in that club is £12. So it's probably a less glamorous Saturday afternoon than the one you might have thought I was having a minute ago. This is quite a kind of a loose brief that I picked up from Stuart, and we actually planned it. So we had a conversation as well. So it's not like I've just kind of blundered in and not given anything a minute's thought. But even on the back of the conversation, Stuart's brief was say something about community, say something about relationships, say something about health creation, something about what the stuff that's going on in Greater Manchester at the moment might prompt in terms of interesting research questions. So I am going to try and have a go at telling a bit of a story, because we are in a slightly unusual place in Greater Manchester. So some of the story will, I guess, take place over the last 5 or 6 years in relation to the devolution of health and social care and how we secured and responded to that opportunity. It will recognise that the way that we responded it actually, I think, says quite a lot about the development and creation of communities. It'll say quite a lot about relationships and their importance. And I think, again, following a kind of another motif, where I think we've been encouraged today to kind of offer a bit of ourselves in terms of the kind of the subject matter that we might be speaking about. I'm going to try and put a couple of kind of personal reflections into that as well, because I have quite a strong view that belief and values are quite an important part of the reason why we come to work, and I have quite a deep belief in the power of public service to do good. So I'm kind of ideologically motivated, if you like, in terms of the work that I might describe, and I will try. I'm not sure how successfully I'll try, but I will try to prompt a couple of notes, I think, on where this takes us into unusual territory in terms of the relationship with the research community and the kind of research questions that we might provoke. I think I want to say something a bit kind of personal at the start. This is riffing slightly for me as well. So when I usually do stuff, it's on a very, very tight brief, and I usually have very densely populated slides with lots of words and lots of numbers and lots of charts and graphs in, and I've not got any of that today, and that's partly because I think I wanted to start with a sense of the kind of the story for me in terms of the health of the population of Greater Manchester and my role in relation to that. It does start a bit in terms of what I see as kind of day one of a public service career, and it was really interesting listening to Jenny early on this morning and her kind of the Uganda kind of epiphany, the Uganda story, and then how that's trailed through kind of Jenny's professional and academic career. And I still kind of look back to a sort of similar moment, I think, because I was a politics graduate in 1991, and for anybody who graduated in 1991, it was that kind of famous thing of the careers office had one or two choices. One was the army and one was McDonald's, and we were kind of that kind of Generation X that were confronted a kind of very low value degree. And a very kind of challenging job market. So I spent 2 years after graduation working in a warehouse, feeling like I was carrying on the family tradition of my dad as a Salford labourer, and I kind of lost patience with that, and I went to a place that was just about to be called Moldova. At the time I applied, it was called Moldavia, and I applied for it because it sounded impossibly romantic. And there was a Prince of Moldavia in, I think it was a Dynasty spin-off. And I thought, this sounds just incredible. I was thinking it would feel like just joining medieval royalty. And the minute I got there, I realised it had just attained the status of Europe's poorest country at the time, and I went there to teach English. And this was late 2003, so we're a bit after Boris Yeltsin on the tank outside Ostankino television station, and the moment of collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a kind of an interesting community in its own right. And the time I landed in Moldavia, the currency had collapsed more or less the same day. There was a civil war in the south of the country, so we were encouraged to stay in the capital. And it kind of, as a kind of, I don't know, still an interested politics student, I got a sense quite quickly that the kind of the gift or the opportunity I'd been given was to see what life was like for people without government. Because the way that the economy was being run then was that there were some quite terrifying looking fellas coming out of the army in Afghanistan at the time that were hoovering up quite a lot of resource. If you were old or disabled or poor, you really were in trouble in that country. And the removal, the absence of government, is an amazing thing for a politics student to see. And it really did land that point to me about the power and potential of government to do good. In fact, its necessity as a kind of an arbiter between competing rights. So it was that moment, I think, that I kind of committed to a career in public service. I had a funny kind of career. It felt like I'd gone a bit through housing, which felt like a good place to start. It was the biggest part of local government at the time that I joined. I kind of got into policy elements of it and ended up moving through different bits of public service and landed in the health system, or the health and social care system, about 11 or 12 years ago. And again, I think this was all within Greater Manchester. I felt a kind of obviously a kind of a home connection with the place, and there were interesting things happening in Greater Manchester over that period. Not least the kind of the point of the picture above my head. So at the time, and going back to 2008-9, which is where I think the health and social care devolution story starts. The leaders in Greater Manchester had done something really quite unusual and I think bold, because what they'd initiated was a thing that was called the Manchester Independent Economic Review, and I was, I think, an observer. So I was working on coordinating collaboration across the health system in Greater Manchester, and supporting development of hyperacute stroke services and major trauma services, getting hospitals to work together, getting commissioners to work together, and at the same time keeping an eye on what was happening in a wider Greater Manchester discussion. In that wider Greater Manchester conversation was a real interrogation about what does it take to create successful places, and what does it take to support successful lives. And the commissioning of that independent economic review in 2008-9 was a really brave step for the leaders of the 10 authorities in Greater Manchester to take, because they didn't try and control the outputs of that. They were aware of the risks of the reflections of that review coming back on them quite badly, in terms of the way they'd led the councils, in terms of the way they'd led their collaboration and cooperation across the councils. But they were keen to explore the answer, and I think that kind of intellectual curiosity is something that ought to be a feature of the way we think about public service. I think the minute that we lose it, public service starts to ossify and fails the people that it's meant to serve. So they asked a really big question around Greater Manchester's potential, and in particular around Greater Manchester's economic potential. And again, all the time, I'm just an interested reader of these kind of provocative public service reports that are coming out of this process. And through the course of this independent economic review, this map is a picture from one of the pages of the review. And what it shows is essentially a kind of a heat map of economic activity and economic value. And the argument that was being pursued at the time in Greater Manchester was that actually the UK economy overall suffers because of the dominance of London and the South East in terms of economic activity. So the UK has an interest in finding where greater growth might sit in the UK economy. And what it pointed to was something quite powerful about Greater Manchester's potential. So this independent economic review that used Goldman Sachs and Harvard Business School and a fairly kind of unimpeachable global economic panel of experts said Greater Manchester's economic potential is enormous. And everyone was thinking, bingo, this is exactly what we're looking for. It's the way for us to start winning an argument with government around devolution and greater power, resort and responsibility for Greater Manchester as a city region. The difficult part of the message from the same review was that we wouldn't achieve that economic potential, and there were a number of reasons why we wouldn't achieve that economic potential. Firstly, we hadn't established a community of leadership that recognised Greater Manchester needed to be planned and operated as a single coherent economic geography. So that was the prompt for the combined authority. But the other messages were much more resonant across wider public service, and the other messages made me think that actually I've got to my career needs to take a different path, because there's something in here that we need to respond to. Because the other messages that came back were Greater Manchester wouldn't achieve its potential as a place because the levels of school readiness and the success of the school careers of its children were too low, and the health of its population was too poor. So going back to one of the points that Jenny made, recognising that Greater Manchester is in its third century of poor health, there was a real prompt, I think, for those of us working in the health sector to say, actually, what is our contribution to Greater Manchester's successful place? And what's our contribution to Greater Manchester's residents' ability to attain successful lives? So suddenly there was a different conversation starting that recognised that health and social care in response to what started as an economic development plan, but actually what didn't conclude as an economic development plan, that was actually about connecting the conditions of somebody's life to ensure that they realise their potential. Now, that started a kind of devolution conversation that finished with kind of where we are now, really, with an elected mayor, a combined authority. There was quite a lot of resistance, I think, about people at the Treasury getting that health and social care was a relevant part of that discussion. There's an awful lot of that conversation at the time that was really about transport systems, it was about inward investment, it was about infrastructure, and the Bank of New York landing in Greater Manchester. But we were really clear that there were 250,000 people in Greater Manchester long-term economically inactive, of working age. 70% have long-standing mental health conditions, 20% of those have long-standing musculoskeletal conditions. Our prompt was we've got some health conditions to respond to in order to allow people to find and keep good work. And unless we do that, actually Greater Manchester will stay abandoning that proportion of its population, regardless of how successful we are. Now, there's a degree of kind of, I guess, another feature of the conversations, which is about, I suppose, about Mancunian audacity. So I think some stuff that it's in the water, or whether it's in the atmosphere, or it's in the character of people of Manchester, that made us try and pursue that question of, we think there is a different conversation on the way that we think about health and care services, and we think about where power and responsibility services lie, and think how those services need to change in order to improve 3.7 million residents of Greater Manchester. And the Mancunian audacity bit, I think, is recognising that trying to knock on the door of the Treasury saying we need to talk about the devolution of health and social care because we need to connect it to a bigger story within so there was a train journey to the Treasury in September 2014 with 3 or 4 of us that didn't really know what we were going to say to the Treasury. But this point about what we describe as kind of a ship canal mentality, where suddenly something that feels impossible and distant becomes conceivable, because people dare to propose it. We said, well, actually, what we need is the whole thing. We need the total control of all of the health and care resource in Greater Manchester, and we need to ask for £500 million of transformation funding in order to recognise that we need to invest in radically altered models of care. Now that moved quite quickly from what was quite moved to Osborne and Simon Stevens before the end of February, 4 or 5 months later. And the deal was that actually they thought there was something happening in Greater Manchester as well. They thought there was something unusual and with enormous potential around matching that kind of civic leadership with a bit of democratic reality in it, and the possibility of the new at the time, along with clinical leadership and the ability to coordinate and collaborate the whole of the health and social care system at the same time. So there was, at the level of Treasury, government, Simon Stevens, at the highest levels of NHS England, there was a kind of belief that we might be into something here, that they would give us the total resource for NHS England, commissioning budget for NHS England, but they challenged us to describe what clinical and financial sustainability of the health and care system would look like, and challenged us to describe that within 6 or 7 months. So to come up with a plan that would say what that path would take. And I think in terms of our kind of theme for today, our reaction to that opportunity says an awful lot about our value that we place in community and collaboration, and the value that we place in the power of the expertise of residents of Greater Manchester, 110 health and care workers. I think we produced quite an unusual plan. I think we produced quite an unusual plan with an awful lot of humility in it. And in the same way as that economic review said, what's Greater Manchester's economic potential? What we were keen to do was to say, what's Greater Manchester's health potential? Who contributes and how do we so think of, NHS change plans over the course of the last 12 or 20 or 30 years. It's all been about doing stuff to people. It's all been about doing stuff in different ways to people. It's been, the changes have lived in the context almost of kind of laboratory conditions, so it's all eminently controllable. It doesn't value complexity, it doesn't value people, it doesn't value the messiness of the real problems that we're trying to solve, which are are related to the lives. We recognise that. Apologies for anybody if I was drifting in and out there. We'd recognised, I think, some traditional problems that we were trying to solve. Firstly, that we had a system that was based on fragmentation, and that we fragmented providers of healthcare, we fragmented commissioners of healthcare, we allowed regulators to fragment us further. We had a system that at one level you could argue manufactures demand, because it sets its point of intervention largely relating to crisis and blue light and A&E. They're the bits of the system that never turn off. So actually they're the parts of the system that are the stopping point. We never challenge ourselves in terms of time travel to say, actually, where was the moment where vulnerability first surfaced, and what was the opportunity of a different kind of intervention then? Because if we did, we would find that the intervention was probably not medical. It's health benefiting, but it may not be medical. And we had that challenge around, I think Jenny's point this morning, that we too often view people as units of need, and we don't view them as people with aspirations and power and talent and strength. And we were really keen to pour all of that in. So there are bits of that plan that are highly traditional, and they're about efficiency, productivity, they're about coordinating very specific services in very different ways, because actually there are things that, even in the context of management, I suppose, rather than the complex leadership coordination of a community, are really about us doing the right things for the right reasons. So they're about tackling variation and doing straightforward things. But at the same time, they were also recognising that actually we needed to change the relationship between the public and their public services. And we needed to value the strengths and talents of communities and individuals in Greater Manchester. And we needed to introduce a degree of humility on the extent to which we couldn't improve the conditions of everybody's lives, purely by carrying on doing things to them, and a degree of humility on the medical side, that actually, if we were to realise the health potential of the population of Greater Manchester, it wouldn't be done through medical intervention, or only a proportion of it would be done through medical intervention. So this was going to be around how ready people are for school, how successful they are in their school career, how tight and sustainable their relationships with their friends and family are, whether they can keep good employment. So actually, there's quite a lot of those of us that were holding the pen for the plan and were excited by what Derek Wanless said about empowered populations, and what Michael Marmot said about the things that actually create health and the things that actually damage health. We're really keen to get some of that in the report. So we've got quite an unusual plan. We've got a plan that does quite an odd thing, because we've held that belief that if we ask the question of how do you maximise the health potential of a population and who contributes, we've got to have a door open to being surprised by who turns up to say that they've got a contribution to make. So what's kind of contained within it is a recognition that when we asked the question, we were surprised by who came up and said, actually, we think we can do something here. People who believed that they had a contribution to make to realising the health potential of Greater Manchester's population. And this, for us, started to, I think there are two kind of key parts here. Firstly, it created a community around health benefit that we hadn't valued before or recognised. And secondly, it pointed us into a territory of what we might describe as intervention that was entirely novel for us. And I think this is where the heart of the kind of the conversation lies for us, in terms of who are relevant participants in this journey, and what does it say about the way that we think traditionally about where's the nugget in terms of grand strategy and research strategy as part of within the journey that we're pursuing now. So I'll give you a couple of examples. When we asked the question, who contributes to health benefit in Greater Manchester, we got a very direct and very clear response from the Fire and Rescue Service that said, we're potentially the most significant front door level public health service that you could ever create. We undertake 45,000 highly targeted safe and well checks. They used to call them home fire risk assessments, and they don't now, because they recognise that they're asking different questions. We were really clear that we would have a different kind of relationship with the people that provide employment support across Greater Manchester. So a kind of direct acknowledgement with each other that we each had a part to play in supporting the kind of return to successful life of people that have been economically inactive. And that was us recognising that we needed to coordinate different kinds of mental health provision and different kinds of musculoskeletal provision, and employment support, recognising that actually valuing that kind of health intervention as a necessary part of the blend, along with CV practice or job interview practice, and along with things like debt advice and family support, were likely to be essential components in the blend, or the recipe that they needed to create. And it's coming up with really unusual things, I think, things that are kind of startling for me as somebody who see the commissioning and provision of, say, psychological therapies in Greater Manchester, and know that that's undertaken by a relatively limited number of providers, see exactly the same psychological therapy provided in the context of Working Well, the employment support programme, and see very, very different results coming out of that. So what we're finding is that recovery rates for people that are part of that employment support programme are about 25% higher than recovery rates for exactly the same psychological therapy intervention that takes place with exactly the same provider, but without the context of family support, debt advice. So I think we're into some quite novel territory about the things that start to make a difference. At the same time, as you might imagine, you don't get too far into, I guess, what might be a bit of a kind of a Nye Bevan dedicated career that's had half a life in housing and half a life in health, without recognising and encouraging the response of housing providers across Greater Manchester to understand what they can do in terms of warm homes, in terms of sustainability, the quality and security of family life, and the housing providers have run towards as well. to try and make their contribution. Similarly, we started a conversation that opened the door to all the schools in Greater Manchester, and we didn't know what would happen. We booked a rugby league stadium and invited all the schools and said we want to talk about mental health, and we didn't know what happened. And actually, 250 schools came and said we want to do something. So we're really keen to kind of tap into their energy and willingness to be part of our mental health, emotional well-being support to every child in Greater Manchester, and they're really keen to do it. And actually, it's a simple thing to organise, but unless you're recognising that this is about more than implementing a plan, it's about cultivating a new set of community, and it's about cultivating a movement around health creation and health potential. And we don't know how much of it it'll take to answer the big question of when does Greater Manchester turn its kind of 3 centuries old corner in terms of poor health. But for the first time, we're actually encouraging the right level of participants in terms of where the evidence tells them what creates health relationships. How am I doing for time? I'm fine. Good. I want to say a bit about then, if that's the community, and our research questions are taking us into territory that is distinctly non-medical, and is more about the contributions of different public service partners, different communities. It does start to point us towards trying to understand the nature of the relationships that exist between us. Jenny mentioned making every contact count, and that feels like something for all the right kind of incentives. It was trying to recognise that there is enormous potential in the human-to-human contact that takes place at every level of the health and care system. But it does turn it into a bit of a programme. It turns it into a kind of professional competence that you can be trained for and directed within. It feels like it loses some of the humanity of that contact, and it feels like it discourages ordinary conversation. So I think we are into a territory when we think about workforce transformation in health and care. I think we're a bit beyond that kind of programmable laboratory condition, professional competence. Make every contact count. Here's 5 things that you must do when you make every contact count. And into actually, how do we value human-to-human contact? How do we have different conversations with people that actually potentially proactively and directly challenge some of our historic beliefs that we've viewed people as units of need, and we assess and weigh them as a series of comorbidities or conditions, and spend much less time on what a good day for them would look like and what it would take to help them have a good day, and then get to the point around medical support or clinical intervention. And I think we've got a couple of really good examples where we're starting to uncover some of that. And there are places in Greater Manchester, probably the most deeply practiced at the moment is Wigan, where this concept of different conversations, and it running through every public servant in Wigan. And every public servant in Wigan, for those of you that are as old as me, recognising that one of the things that we used to do if we worked in a community setting 25 or 30 years ago, so when I was a housing officer, and there was very little resource in public service at that time in the kind of early 90s, early mid-90s, but we knew what was going on, and actually we took responsibility for the problems of people's everyday life. We weren't over-professionalised or kind of over-mandated or controlled in what we did, and we did value human-to-human contact. And some of this stuff is starting to come back, and I went on Wigan's training for this, and it's a fascinating thing, a kind of a journey in ethnography that tells you a bit about what human-to-human contact looks like, and how you have some of those conversations that do start to value the assets and strengths of the people that you're working with. And they've got this kind of library stock of amazing stories where there is a social worker going out to do an assessment to somebody with a hip fracture who just returned home in Wigan and thought that what they were going to do is a bit of respite care for the 45 minutes. I'm on my way there. Bit of respite care for the husband. X, Y, and Z for the lady, and then out onto the next job. And actually, through this process, what they did was just take stock of the house. Noticed on the wall a tapestry, and said, "That's nice. That's interesting." And this woman lit up and said, "Well, actually, that I did that. That's what I used to do. That was my hobby." And actually, what she found was like, "Oh, I know. There's a group of people who do tapestries and sewing, and it's only kind of 2.5 streets away." And this woman now does this 3 or 4 times a week and does a bit of training and kind of support and a bit of teaching to people in the community who want to get into it as well. It's not formal daycare that her husband needs, because actually he gets the respite because she's doing this. And they've got this stock of amazing stories. And actually what it does, it changes the balance of formal social care that we actually need to fill. And there's enormous potential in us thinking or stopping thinking about just layering on formal public service over and over again without thinking of actually what might change the conditions of that person's life. And I think that's why I kind of come back to this thing at the picture. I don't know whether anybody recognises this, because when you look at the themes that you've got going through today around communities and about relationships, you do recognise that actually it's the relationships that really get us into novel territory, and it's kind of setting aside some of the things that we might have been trained for and might feel like reassuring professional competence that gets us into a kind of different conversation and makes us think very differently about who can contribute to our kind of ambitions and objectives at work. And I speak to kind of fascinating groups of people because I think suddenly we're open to this notion of creating a movement. I was with a new body in Manchester a couple of weeks ago, Caribbean and African Health Network, and I was thinking when I saw who was there, 70 or 80 people connected to both groups, neighbourhoods, churches, and other kind of faith networks across Manchester, with really quite a unique and insightful insight into health status, health challenges, life challenges of a specific population within and across Greater Manchester. And I was thinking, actually, if that didn't exist, I would have worried about needing to invent it. But because it does, the only thing I need to do is just demonstrate that we value it, open the door, and then let the expertise in and let the expertise take control. So the reason I keep pointing at this is because this is it's a picture from the Arundel Tomb. It's a Philip Larkin poem, and it's the bit I think that it kind of takes me back to a sense of belief in the potential of public service, and a belief that public service relies on high quality relationships, because the final line in the poem is the line that I would quite like to see kind of when I retire. It's the line I would quite like to kind of reflect on when I think of a kind of public service career, because the final line in this is, what will survive of us is love, and I think that's kind of the reason why I come to work, and the reason why I'm really excited by people who point towards the potential of novel relationships. I hope that's been helpful.